Alright students, welcome back to 1450. I hope you are all doing well, and I hope you are all a little bit relaxed after a relatively light week, let's hope. Just as a reminder, I hope you will all have read the Song of Roland by the time that you are watching this lecture. And furthermore, as a reminder, this Wednesday, that is, I believe, June 3rd, something around there, off the top of my head, is when the study guide for Song of Roland is due on e-learning. That will count as discussion points. Plus, it will help you a whole lot to do that, because it'll help you understand the plot of a relatively difficult piece. But that is just a bit of a side note. You do have a source analysis due this Sunday as well, and it will be on sources in the Chivalry and Courtly Love lecture, which will be the next lecture. But anyway, let us dive into Travel and Commerce, one of my personal favorite lectures of this semester, and I hope you all end up liking it as well. It's less conceptual than many of the other lectures we're going to be talking about in the second half of the semester, and more talking about actual concrete things. So, today we're going to be going deeper into the economics of the High Middle Ages. I've bandied around this term and other terms before, but let's talk about these periods to some extent. When we started this course, we began in what's called the quote-unquote late antiquity period, basically the later part of the Roman Empire until the Western Roman Empire collapses. Afterwards, we spent some time talking about the early Middle Ages, which includes the formation of the Frankish kingdom, Charlemagne, the Vikings, Islam, the foundation of Islam, I should say, and so on. Starting with lordship and rule, we began this transition to talk about the High Middle Ages with the development of feudalism. This period is given general dates of approximately 1000 to 1250, though as with all things, dividing lines are loose at best. This period is characterized by the growing popularity of the feudal systems, as well as the birth and peak of crusade activity. But it was also characterized by economic, civil, urban, and general population growth. Now, when we consider cities before this period, there have been some, and we've probably mentioned a few. There's the cities in the Muslim world, such as Mecca, Damascus, and Baghdad. There's also Rome, and we've also mentioned Constantinople a few times. In the Eastern Roman Empire, large cities survived and grew under Muslim rule when they were conquered. But in the Western Roman Empire, almost all declined after the empire lost control. Even Rome is a shadow of its former self, going from possibly as many as 1 million people at its height, now down to maybe a few tens of thousands. Rome will not recover appreciably until the Renaissance, but for many cities, this is about to change in this time period we are talking about. So why do cities start to develop in the first place? Well, first of all, security. Viking attacks have ended with the steady conversion of Scandinavia to Christianity. While the Norse kingdoms certainly continue raiding and warfare, it is now turned against the quote-unquote pagans in the Baltic, that is Finland, Poland, Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia. Despite increasing pressure, Lithuania won't convert until 1387. This is good both for cities not getting sacked and trade routes less liable to being raided. In addition, despite wars by no means being a thing of the past, comparatively stable realms exist that provide space for economic growth. The increasing practice of primogeniture, that is, passing land to the firstborn son, helps prevent the splitting of realms and the squabbling between siblings that were an obstacle to the early development of the Holy Roman Empire. As part of this, trade routes that have remained small in scale since the collapse of the Western Roman Empire have begun again. You can see here this map of Roman roads, which gives you some idea of the vast trade network that is starting to move again. Now, with the integration of Scandinavia into Western Christianity, the trade routes they establish also are pathways on which goods can move. Russian principalities form, and trade continues to move through them, and thus you have this notable transference of Western European goods centered around mainly England, France, parts of Spain, and Scandinavia, slowly pushing its way towards the east, as Viking paths of travel and old trade routes are sort of reappropriated into newer, more modern trade routes. Italian city-states and the events of the Crusades both pique Western interest in and give them more control over trade routes further to the east, going even well past the Muslim-controlled world to valuable trade goods in the Islamic world and beyond. And additionally, the population overall is booming. This is boosted by developments in agriculture and a particularly good climate for agriculture in Europe. Now, let's mention these agricultural developments in more detail, as they were crucial to the rise in productivity that supported a population boom. First, we have the development of the Hames collar, a collar made to allow horses to be yoked to a plow. The wood yokes you see on the oxen would strangle a horse. So a new design was needed to put the pressure on horses safely. You can see a Hames collar here in the image. This is a late 19th or early 20th century design, but fundamentally the same as the medieval versions. Scythes, which were probably a Roman invention, spread as well. Although much faster, they are generally used only to cut hay to feed livestock because they lack an ability to keep the grain falling every which way. It still makes harvesting large fields faster and feeding animals easier. Plows, which early on were little more than an ox, or now horse in this case, driven driving stick, gaining mold boards, look more like what we usually think of a plow today. These boards allow the soil to be turned, better mixing soil and creating rows of ridges and furrows where the soil is scooped out. This ensures at least some harvest, as rainy years will not flood crops on the ridges, while in dry years those in furrows still have enough water. Many fields in Europe, especially England, enclosed as pastures in the 16th century, still have this washboard pattern. Many of three-field rotation, or systems of three-field rotation, also begin to be enforced, alternating between a year of fall grain planting, a year of spring grain planting, and legume planting to restore soil nutrients. And then one final year of fallow, that is, no crops are grown, to round out the cycle. The system helped maintain yields over the long term. The final development is the growth of agriculture done communally, with households owning the proceeds of a few strips worth from a long field. Since disasters could easily strike one plot but leave another unharmed, this helped ensure that while disaster could still strike the community, individual families would not be doomed by bad luck. These new developments will go hand in hand with the bounty of the medieval warm period from about 800, wherein the world entered a period of slightly higher world temperatures. In Europe, this helped fuel population growth by allowing agriculture to move further north, such as to Greenland. The prosperity helped farmers transition from basic subsistence crops to more valuable crops. The period's warmth helped with wine being produced even as far north as England. Regions became known for the production of specific agricultural goods, such as English wool and French wine. Between farmers, rulers, and monasteries, especially the Cistercians, land clearance, the removal of forest and scrub, and preparation for agricultural got seriously underway. And just imagine trying to actually clear an acre of land without any power tools, and even with only a very few number of metal tools as well. Especially in the Low Countries, that is modern-day Netherlands and Belgium, primarily, and in East Anglia in England, swamps and marshes are drained. All this new land helps support the rising population and wealth. As peasants start growing cash crops as opposed to just subsistence crops, many regions start to specialize in specific goods. Most specialize based on available or farmable resources. Wine in France, and more broadly in Southern Europe, which can supply Northern Europe's need for wine, a necessity for Christian communion. Rarer resources like amber or precious gems also are a source of wealth, and basic resources like iron are not found everywhere. Notice anything odd? Well, for one, there's ivory coming from Greenland, if you look up here. Walrus for centuries supplied much of Europe's ivory needs. Also note cloth coming from the Low Countries, an outgrowth of urban areas that early on developed growing cloth industries, which grew even as more and more they were supplied by English wool. So this higher population needs more goods, and with regions producing even more specialized product, they need more things from different places. To supply this need, merchants become a more common profession. But how did they travel? For starters, let's take a look at this map right here. I know when you first see it, you probably don't think it is a map because it just looks so different from what we normally understand a map to look like. This is often referred to as a TO map. While not used as a map with which to travel, well, I mean, someone probably did, but they almost certainly had a very bad time using it. It conceptually describes their world, anybody who used this map. We can see major seas, that is, the Atlantic expanded into a sea ringing all the land, the Mediterranean, the Red Sea. This branch is usually the Black Sea. And if you reduce this world to a simple diagram, you might find Jerusalem sits somewhere about the middle. An ideal way of depicting a Christian worldview. Seas here function as barriers, splitting the continents. But this image is a bit misleading as well. So, here's some modern maps marking out Viking and Islamic trade routes. Note how many of them go by sea. Sea trade is faster and can be cheaper per round of cargo. Roads are kind of unreliable. Unlike the Romans, who invested in a good road system, mostly to move their army around very efficiently, there is no central authority to invest in roads. And in fact, national road systems are a very late invention. Think of around the start of the 20th century, when it took 62 days for a military convoy to cross the U.S. by road. There can also be dangers, such as bandits, hostile territory, and so on. But oceans can be dangerous as well. Though faster and more efficient, entire ships can be lost with no survivors. As merchants grow in size and number, they start to work together, forming trade companies. That way, when disaster strikes, the group can shoulder the costs. This is the start of systems of insurance. But why don't we take a quick look at a letter from one trade company that had to consider these issues? Hopefully you have all read it by now, and this is specifically the Detini letter. But first question is what kind of goods are being moved? Well, we have conventional goods like woad, a common blue clothing dye, but some goods come from further afield, and some quote-unquote goods aren't materials at all. They are people. Slavery, despite the church's discomfort with the practice, was reasonably common in medieval Europe. While just as much a violation of human rights as any other form of slavery, medieval Europe did not possess the sort of slave societies as in ancient Rome and Greece, or in the antebellum South. Slaves were still a source of labor for the few real cash crops of medieval Europe and given domestic tasks, although this letter seems to imply a much darker purpose for a slave. Beyond a slave, who else is mentioned in the letter? Well, we see mention of family members being given work opportunities and the recipient's wife being given a gift. These companies function as much as businesses as social networks of merchants, cooperating to take advantage of economic opportunities and preparing the next generation to take the reins when they grow up. Now, there's a mention of political events. What is this about? Well, the letter mentions a conflict in Catalonia, located about here in eastern Spain. These networks provide information about political developments. War can be bad for business, closing trade routes, impoverishing or killing those in the path of the conflict, and making work all the more dangerous. Of course, they can also be a major opportunity. In addition to growing populations and rise in trade goods, technological developments are facilitating trade. Magnetic compasses and astrolabes arrive from the east. Compasses allow sailors to know what direction they sail at any time of day or when weather obscures the normal signposts, the stars. Astrolabes are devices that allow sailors to measure the angle of the stars, including the sun, from the horizon. Using this, they can identify their latitude and angle, or rather, better determine where they are and thus where they need to go. Additionally, cartography is improving. Ships are using charts to help them navigate, aided by the compass and the astrolabe. Sea charts can contain information not only of the shape of coasts, but where it is safe to land, or where dangerous weather patterns often strike. Shipbuilding has also improved. The shipbuilding methods used by the Vikings have been adopted and modified, with rudders now fixed on the stern or rear of ships. But beyond that, merchants are now often literate as well, keeping extensive records and, as we see in the Detini letter, enabling communication and coordination across large distances. By the 13th century, merchants, particularly those from Italian city-states, were willing to go far afield to find new goods and markets. Starting in 1271, Marco Polo, traveling with other merchants to the east, reached China. China, ruled at the time by Kublai Khan, had been conquered only a few generations earlier by the emergent Mongol Empire. Under his rule, it remained a source of valuable trade goods, especially silk. Although the Mongol conquest itself was bloody, Mongol rule was good for trade, keeping a vast contiguous region under the rule of one power, which understood that safe trade routes led to incredible wealth. There is also one other merchant organization we should discuss. The Radhanites were a group of Jewish merchants across Europe and the Middle East who formed a trade network that stretched across continents. Radhanites, and indeed all Jews, lacked a religious injunction against usury. If you recall from our discussion of the Crusades, usury is the practice of lending for money, connected to Christian concepts of sin and greed, and deep-seated ideological issues with money earned without the creation of a tangible product. This idea of usury is also applied to trade, as merchants make money creating nothing. Yes, transport is hard work, but the objects are the same when they leave a merchant's possession as when they enter it. Excluded from land ownership, many take part in trade and monetary industries or other crafts that do not require land. Let's take a look at the descriptions of the Radhanites. First of all, where do the merchants reach? Well, as you can see from the map that we provide, France, Constantinople, Egypt, and even India and China. This is a huge network of merchants, really. And what do they take with them? They take spices, furs, silk, and yes, once again, people. Note how a lot of these goods are ones that are high value for their weight. It pays to move silk from China to Rome, but not grain. So what are the benefits of these long trade networks? Well, there is the first thing mentioned. The long networks give access to and knowledge of languages, and probably the information gleaned from having access to people fluent in these languages. Long networks mean goods travel far to where they are needed most or valued highest. It also means that almost no matter where a Radhanite travels, they have access to local contacts and knowledge to help them on their way. Now that we've discussed trade and trade networks, let's turn to the growth of cities and talk about how the two are connected. As farmers increasingly grow crops not only to fulfill their needs but to sell for cash, they need places to sell them. Markets form, starting as very temporary meeting places to sell goods. Over time, these markets grow to be a permanent and important fixture, and communities grow around them. Think a little bit about how this developed. After a market starts, what kind of services might people want, and how might these industries foster the growth of others? Markets and towns are crucial for craftsmen. Instead of serving a small community but having to still farm to make a living, central markets allow craftsmen to specialize, serving larger communities that don't need huge amounts of a resource. A goldsmith probably can't make a living selling only to the local village, but with a market, they can devote their labor to their craft more readily. Fairs help serve larger audience, drawing in merchants from further afield and giving reasons for distant communities to come and purchase what they need. Most occur on saints' days or other religious holidays, corresponding with the peaks of pilgrim activity. More on that in a little bit. So, let's talk a bit about how cities and markets interacted with rulers. A lot of early medieval trade was done without coinage. The Vikings, in particular, did not mint or produce currency. This isn't to say that coins had no value, but that the economy was based around barter. A silver coin wasn't worth 1 dirham, but merely the weight of silver it represented. But coinage is an effective way to store wealth. Travelers can move with coins instead of goods, instead of the goods' value needed to survive, as can merchants. More importantly, farmers can store wealth in non-perishable forms. Rather than all their wealth being crops and animals that can die or go bad, people could store wealth until needed. Of course, in times of famine where nobody has food, you can't eat silver. Coins have another role for rulers. Coins generally bear the faces of rulers that mint them. How better to declare your omnipresent power than to have people seeing your face when buying everything from flour to jewelry to a horse. Another crucial role rulers had was in defining the legal authority of markets and cities through charters and grants. As rulers sought to control commerce, they wanted to direct it to certain areas and to benefit the most from it. Grants for markets help control competition, ensuring flourishing markets weren't stymied by new markets growing nearby. So let's take a brief look at the grant for a market at Donauwörth. First things first, who is giving the grant for the charter at Donauwörth? You'll see that the grant specifies market days, preventing the market from running as randomly or inconsistently. This helps both make markets consistent institutions and prevents them from overly competing with the nearest markets. It also lists legal consequences, specifying how violations of the market are to be prosecuted. This ensures the market has legal authority, but authority dependent on the emperor's delegation of his own power. The town growing around it, dependent on the market, thus exists by the emperor's dispensation. Within these towns, especially as they specialize or grow very large, multiple craftspeople gather in one place. Competition is good, but can be bad for the success of businesses. Guilds were one response to this. Some were explicitly economic relationships between craftsmen, whereas some were religious communities, but many combine the two. Pooled resources allow these small communities to protect against disaster as well as to fund larger projects, like shrines for community worship. Merchant and craft guilds often act something like unions, setting industry standards, regulating how new members were trained, and so on. They were often supported by towns or even higher authorities who appreciated industries conforming to regulations. Of course, all this can come with downsides. Setting prices can be good for the guild's business but bad for customers. And guilds were not always welcoming to new members. But such guilds provided security for many, even in some cases offering women access to industries. Now let's take a quick look at the guild regulations in your primary sources. Women in the Parisian craft guilds circa 1270. Consider why these rules would serve the interest of a guild. Guilds were often fairly small, but this form of association could expand well beyond the bounds of cities or even kingdoms. The Hansa, or the Hanseatic League, is the largest example of this. They were a group of trade cities along the coasts of the North Sea and the Baltic Sea, especially Germany, the Netherlands, and into the south coast of the Baltic Sea. They reached their height in the 13th century. Existing outside the feudal system, they were effectively a loose confederation of cities with trade and defensive agreements. In many ways, they were a merchant guild grown to a massive scale. They brokered deals, interfered in governments to ensure favorable trade, and many cities took part in wars, sometimes even against one another. Kingdoms like Denmark did not always fare well against them. They were a massive economic and political force to be reckoned with through the end of the Middle Ages and carrying on even well into the early modern period. Now, before we finish up, there's one other aspect of economics, and especially travel, we need to talk about. As in all times, religious belief does not always prevent people from making mistakes or feeling the need to atone. As part of atonement, many underwent pilgrimage. We've talked a bit about a form of pilgrimage before, and that is for Muslims, the Hajj, the pilgrimage to Mecca, which those with the means should make at least once in their lives. Similar practices began in Christianity. Pilgrims would visit cathedrals and many holy sites. Cathedrals were often a draw for increasingly more impressive architecture, but also housed saints' relics. Cathedrals are often sites where famous relics of saints are housed. Some pilgrims would visit shrines to general saints, but some saints had specific miracles associated with them. Rome and Jerusalem had numerous saints' relics and associations with Christianity's histories. Santiago de Compostela, a site dedicated to St. James the Apostle in Galicia, the northwestern corner of the Iberian Peninsula specifically, also became a focal point for pilgrimage. In particular, going there and receiving a scallop shell became a major symbol for traveling the Camino de Santiago, the way of St. James. Pilgrims take this path to this day. The Crusades were often described as an armed pilgrimage. They borrow heavily from this imagery, but pilgrims often borrow right back, with wearing a cross on clothing, initially a crusading icon, being adapted by many pilgrims. At the end of the pilgrimage, pilgrims often made donations. Being along a pilgrimage trail, or better still at the end of one, was liable to bring many travelers, and their money through that area. Churches and cathedrals competed to draw in pilgrims, both to prove the community's piety and to benefit economically. We'll talk in a later lecture about the lengths to which some communities would go and what they would build to ensure pilgrimage. We've talked a bit about a positive picture here of expansion and growth, but the good times would not last forever. The medieval warm period will wind down by the mid-13th century, leading to the Little Ice Age, a period of notably colder temperatures. Increased storms in the late 13th century devastate many regions, leading to famines and flooding. Between these environmental downturns and the lack of easy new land to clear, the population levels either off or even heads back into decline. In the Netherlands, the natural barriers to the sea, eroded by overgrazing, fail, and a new body of water, the Zuiderzee, fills the fields which have been lowered by drainage. To cap it all off, a new disease arrives on the scene. Spreading along the very trade routes bringing wealth to Europe, the Black Death will devastate every population in its wake. But for all that, the political structure of the High Middle Ages will survive, as will the cities. In our next lecture, we'll discuss chivalry and courtly love before we move to Spain and meet a gentleman by the name of El Cid. And that should be a hint for all of you that if you have not yet done so, you should probably pick up your copy of the Poem of the Cid, the third and last text that you have to pay for and obtain for this class.